This magazine is exactly 50 years old this month. So to celebrate, let's have a look inside. Before though, I should mention that for international viewers, Electronics Australia is, or was, one of the leading Australian electronics magazines. There are quite a few, but Electronics Australia has been the most enduring, tracing its lineage back to about 1922 with Wireless Weekly. Then it became Radio and Hobbies in 1939, then Radio, TV and Hobbies in the 50s, and then finally Electronics Australia. The magazine kept going until about 2000 or the early 2000s. Then it became less technical and it died. Before that, a lot of the people that worked for it went to work for Silicon Chip. In fact, the founder of Silicon Chip, Leo Simpson, previously was involved in Electronics Australia, and Silicon Chip remains today as one of the few surviving electronic magazines. So that's a bit of the history. Let's have a look inside. And of course this was quite a turning point for the electronics industry. It was in the last few years, the early 70s were the last few years where a lot of electronics was made in Australia, especially the consumer electronics, radios, TVs, etc. Just a couple of years later, tariffs were brought down and there was a lot of importation of consumer electronics from Japan. And so within 5 years, your typical transistor radio, for instance, instead of being made locally here in Australia, came from Japan. So same also for a lot of the electronic components. Assembly lines closed down within a few months of the tariffs being reduced. That did mean that we had a much bigger range of cheaper consumer electronics than we had before, but it did mean the loss of a large local industry. So let us look inside Electronics Australia, September 1972. It was, by the way, 50 cents. I don't have the conversions for inflation, but I think it's probably close to $10 now. And that is close to the price of what you'd pay for Silicon Chip. On the front cover is a radio telescope in the Netherlands. Here we have a Sony reel-to-reel tape recorder. Cassettes were in then, but they were not seriously considered to be part of a hi-fi system, whereas the reel-to-reel was. Here they claim a circulation in excess of 47,000 and readership of over 211,000. That is different to the number of magazines sold, because I think they assume that multiple people read each magazine. And here a line just mentioning its history. There was also a short-lived magazine called Modern World that didn't last long. As for the contents, this is a very broad magazine, so it had some of your industry news and development there, and your projects and technical. A lot of it was audio and radio, like PA amplifiers and modulator for your ham radio. That's based on people still transmitting AM, which some did then still. A few circuit ideas, we'll look at those in a moment, and some information there for people studying electronics, including making a superhet receiver, so we'll look at that also. And then product reviews, consumer stuff like stereo amplifiers and things. And then there are regular features. They even did record reviews. I think one of the editors of this was very much into music, so yeah, that translated into the content. And then amateur bands and shortwave listening. So yeah, this covered pretty much a whole range of electronic and radio topics, industry, consumer electronics, hobby electronics and projects, and ham radio. So, and here a report on the Consumer Electronics Show. And there we are. This is when we still made resistors in Australia. Looking at some of the names of the people, there's the editorial. Colour TV, yep, Australia was quite backward compared with other countries. In 1972 we didn't yet have colour TV. That was to come in 1975. So yeah, they're still discussing setting it up. Now we did choose the PAL system, which is used in Europe, and that was a good move because it is superior to the NTSC that we could have gone with. Having a look at some of the names, Neville Williams, he's no longer around, but Jim Rowe still is, and still writing articles for Silicon Chip. Ian Pogson was very big in receiver design. He was basically the brains behind a lot of the amateur radio projects. And Ross Tester, I think, still around and still, I think, does a lot of the graphics for, might still be working for Silicon Chip, or maybe just recently retired. Anyway, he's been around for years. So yep, these are the people that were needed to produce a magazine in those days. And then there are all the representatives who handled multiple magazines at the time. Advertisements, Garrett Turntables from the UK. They all had their local agents like Plessy Dukon, and Dukon, of course, are well known for making capacitors. The new stuff right at the beginning, making FETs, electronic music. Speakers. TV was only just starting in India. Oscilloscopes. Now, this is the BWD range. Now, BWD were very famous for their oscilloscopes. So, pretty much every university or laboratory in Australia would have had multiple BWD oscilloscopes. Yeah, still excited with colour TV. Here we are. Philips gets wide industry agreement on VCR format. Now, what format is it? Just looking at those tapes. Well, they're a different shape to VHS. VHS came later. There was U-matic back then, I think. But, yeah, VCRs were not yet quite in the consumer market. So I'm not sure if the format pictured here actually came to anything. And I think Philips had a format called V2000 in Europe, and that was much later, and that again didn't come to anything. So people that bought their videos basically paid hundreds of dollars, pounds, francs, whatever, for a useless video in a few years. More on broadcasting, Telecine. Satellite power. The feasibility of using large satellites to beam down electrical power to Earth. I remember reading about that in my kids' books, but, you know, wonder what would happen if you walked into the desert or whatever and you had these big beams, you'd get fried, I think. Car safety radar uses passive frequency doubler. I presume on the microwaves. Now this was one of the Marantz, one of the big names in hi-fi. Yeah, I think hi-fi was really coming in because by that time all the amplifiers would have been solid state, so people would have replaced their valve amps with something like this. And they were pretty much on the eve of quadraphonic sound, so we'll see if there's any talk about that later on in the magazine. As for components, well, you had quite a lot of suppliers. Dick Smith was around then, but nowhere near as big as what it later became. But you could have a look at some of the prices. Let's have a look at some of these transistors now. I just saw something very familiar there. A BD139, which I still use in my homebrew transmitters, and the price then was $2.35. If you were to walk into JCar now, 40 years later, I think it's just over $1, maybe $1.50. But anyway, if we assume that 50 cents for the magazine was like $10 now, then the price of that transistor would be the equivalent of maybe $50. So yep, it would really ruin your day if you blew one up. And as for more basic transistors, BC107 would have been your basic one if you're making a little light flasher, 75 cents. So multiply that by 20 and $15. So yeah, a kid could afford that, but not very many of them. And for RF, a BF115, that's quite cheap actually, 70 cents. Now they were still selling the germanium transistors like OC70. By that time they were a bit dearer than the silicon transistors. An OC45 for your transistor radio. Now tuning capacitors. Now that's interesting looking at the price. A 10 to 415 picofarad you could get for just over $2. The same price as a BD139. And the price differential is completely the other way round. The tuning capacitors are rare and expensive and the transistors are cheap. But back then, they were much more similar in price. Transformers as well. Matrix board. That was cheap, 20 cents up to 40 cents, 90 cents. Oh, actually 6x6, that was actually quite expensive. So yeah, maybe you would just solder bits together or use bits of wood and nails and things like many people did. A crystal earpiece though you could get for 70 cents, so the equivalent to $14 now, the same price as a magnetic earpiece. So yeah, would have bought those for your crystal set. And filter condensers, they still call them condensers, not capacitors. $6.40, over $100 now. So yep, very expensive if you're building a power supply. Now, Consumer Electronics Show, Alex Ensel. Now that's a name associated with hi-fi. Anyway, all different shapes and speakers and things, and they go through about what it's like to go to a trade show. Life in a computerized environment. They're doing experiments with Goebbels. Now this would have been a big industry, colour TV technicians, and they were offering correspondence courses. And computers in the classroom. Well, it took a long time for it to happen. I was in school in the 80s, in fact pretty much all the 80s, and computers even then didn't exist. They were just coming in, I think. There's one or two teachers brought their own computers in from home, but yeah, it was really not until the 90s and I think that computers came in really in education. 50 cents and get your money back in a free voucher. This was the catalogue that started it all. Dick Smith, apparently they sold more in catalogues than in parts. But yep, you cut out that form, send it in, and with 50 cents and you'd get a catalogue, even with postage stamps. Now there's some pretty heavy science here. Surface waves, microwaves. Four-channel discs. Yep, this is the start of quadraphonic. There's Neville Williams there, writing about all the different systems. I think there were problems with a lot of different incompatible systems. A bit like AM stereo, never really took off. And here we are, stereo amplifiers with inbuilt AM tuner. And of course we didn't have FM broadcasting in Australia then, so there were some trials previously, but they were shut down, so yep, all the radio was still AM. And a multimeter, yep, you would have had one of those as a hobbyist. It even has a capacitance range. That would have been quite revolutionary. But I don't understand this. A capacitance meter that encompasses the 100 microfarad to 10 microfarad range. Doesn't make sense. Anyway, looks like a pretty good instrument from Warbert and Frankie. And here we are. It talks about 4-channel sound not being an established part of the hi-fi scene in Australia. And it never really did. Our projects, our first project, a special offer, which they sometimes did with components or kits. And it's a power amplifier module. And here's a look at the circuit. Microphone input. You could actually buy all the bits and build this today if you wanted to. There's just 2 transistors there as the microphone preamp, bass and treble control. Then we've got lots more transistors here for the power amplifying bit. And then the inbuilt 240 volt power supply. Unregulated, pretty basic. I think you'd be able to buy all the parts today and build it. And it gave you 12 volts RMS. So yep, a PA amplifier. You could even build 2 of them and make a stereo. And even the circuit layout if you're making your own boards at home. We're still only up to page 30, so you better speed up. Here we are, power offer transistor kits, $3.50 each. And here is RF transistors, so yep, if you're building a RF linear amplifier, then these might be useful. Actually, quadraphonic was a dirty word and not many people took it up. But anyway, here's a thing from Electronics Australia explaining all about it. our first amateur radio project, a series modulator. So yeah, this could actually save a bit of money because just by combining them, you're saving on boxes and your power supplies, and or it is a power supply in itself. So just having a look, and it's a tube circuit using two 6DQ6As and a 6BQ5. And there's some transistors in there though, just for the low-level audio stuff. And there's a look at what's inside. And underneath, all tag strips. Everyone had a scope, and you could buy them from IRH. And a look at switches. You can still buy similar today. All these little neighbourhood electronic shops existed back then. And you could buy a radio tuner for the broadcast band for $19.95. So not a kit, but ready to use. If we multiply it by 20 for the price, that's nearly $200 in today's terms. So yeah, you didn't need to sell very much to make a good living with electronics, as it was all quite expensive. These are museum pieces now, cathode ray tubes, and we made them in Australia. O.H. Cunningham was a major supplier. In fact, he was a VK3 ham as well. And around this time, I think interest in hi-fi was picking up. So yeah, quite a few hi-fi things in Electronics Australia. And of course, suppliers could make lots of money if people were willing to buy their full speakers and quad amplifiers, etc. Here they're talking about artificial reverberation, so yeah, more audio. Another multiplier, or multimeter. I think Warbett and Frankie were the test equipment kings. And a letter here in the forum column, which was done by Neville Williams for years and years, and a letter complaining about how hard it is to buy electronic parts in New Zealand. And the Serviceman, well, that column continues today, but in Silicon Chip magazine. And an advertisement on colour conversion. Looks like it's a scam. Yeah, here's Cassettes making a challenge from a maker familiar to hams, Kenwood. And more on reverb. This time a research thing. So yeah, quite serious electronics people, researchers, scientists, whatever, read this magazine. So yep, all about that there. Now you could buy a communications receiver as a kit. Although a lot of people would have built it from scratch, and there are lots of other kits as well, a bit less complicated and a bit cheaper. Now, VK2AHC was a big pioneer in microwave amateur radio, and he did a project on getting started on 10 gigahertz with VK5CU, or he was then VK5CU. And I think, from memory, they were using gun diodes and things, so it was FM on 10 gigahertz. And in fact, there's Actually, no, it might be a bit more complex than that. In fact, looking at the circuit, they've got looks like a big power supply there. This is a whole 10 gigahertz transceiver. And I'm not going to point out everything in the circuit, but there's an IF strip there using ICs, a klystron there, parabolic dish, some diodes in there. And then some plumbing here for the gigahertz frequencies. So yeah, it looks like they're taking the gigahertz in there, microwave diodes, and then they're going straight down to the IF where they're processing it. And down here is the receiver bit, so to diodes and bits and pieces, and then finally to the audio amp. So yeah, and it is FM modulator there. So quite an ambitious project to get on 10 gigahertz. And this is what the transceiver looked like. And I think this actually set some Australian DX records on the microwave bands. Crystals, yep, crystals were big, and you could order yours from Bright Star. This is possibly everyone's favourite column in the magazine, Circuit and Design Ideas. And here is a simple converter for 2 meters from the Journal of the Maitland Radio Club. So looking at that, a couple of valves but no crystals, so it wouldn't have been very stable, but it would be okay for tuning into AM amateurs who used 2 meters back then. And also of interest, a crystal controlled gate dip meter. Now this would have been quite stable. Whole page of multimeters there. And looking at some of the prices, the cheapest one was $15.50, so maybe close to $300 now. So I think people would have built their own multimeters or just had a voltmeter that they, if they could get 1 meter movement and put some resistors in series and in parallel, maybe a vacuum tube amplifier or FET amplifier that would give you higher input impedance, then yet meter movements were expensive then and probably are now, but more so then. Now of course it's cheap just with digital displays and things. Home study course in electronics, build a SUPET receiver. This would have been a lot like the consumer equipment back then. And if we have a look at the circuit, very straightforward SUPET, like maybe 6 or 7 transistors, a ganged tuning capacitor, RF amplifier, autodine mixer, IF filter block. It does use a ceramic filter, and then detector, and then a transformerless audio amp. So this would have been quite a good AM receiver, particularly with the RF preamp. And this is what people could do if they were leaving school and wanted a job. The RAAF School of Radio Apprenticeship, located in Laverton, Victoria. So yet you had to be over 15, under 17, and have done 3 years of secondary school. And here's the circuit board layout for that SUPET receiver. Ross Chester's article, Basic Electronics, on the Australian plugs and sockets. Kit Sets Australia was big for a short time. Don't know what happened to them, but they weren't around for very long. But they preceded Dick Smith in some of the things that they sold. Down here, the Marconi School of Wireless. So yeah, a lot of stuff, you know, for young people in their future and jobs and all that sort of things. A Sinclair, so Clive Sinclair was advertising here, a plug-in amplifier module. So it's more for your non-technical people. And classical recordings. I'll skip through all these. It's funny seeing music reviews right next to relay ads. Japanese stuff coming in. Peter Clark of Magnetic Sound Industries. If you haven't seen it already, there's a great interview on YouTube. So he's still alive and still active in electronics, sort of. But yeah, really inspirational interviewing. Peter Clark of Magnetic Sound Industries. Watch the interview. Now here we are. I was talking about meter movements before. Well, you could buy meter movements, they're only little, for like $5 or $6. In fact, there's some even less, like $3.65 there. So you could have built your own multimeter for significantly cheaper than buying one. A review of a tuner. My eye was caught when it says it covers 3 AM bands and the international FM broadcast band. Looking at the frequency range, it did long wave, medium wave and a shortwave band around 6 megahertz. So really for the European market, not so much here, because 6 megahertz then was a quasi, or was a broadcast band, a lot of European domestic broadcasting there. Now we have here a very early advertisement from J-Car Proprietary Limited, who went on to become Australia's biggest electronic component seller. Tokay, yep, many 27 megahertz pirates would have started on one of these from Peter Chalet. RCS Radio were really big in printed circuit boards. More multimeters. Now if you're a struggling kid, you could have bought this meter movement for $1.50 and maybe put a potentiometer in series with it and use the setting of the potentiometer. You could have a big scale, big knob, and just adjust it for, say, center reading on the meter, and that could have allowed you to measure things without having a big expensive meter movement. Another transceiver, Midland 1 watt for 27240 or 27880, the latter being marine band, $39.95 per unit. So the equivalent of close to $800. Maybe my multiplying of 20 is a bit much. I should check average wages and things like that. But I think it's probably about fair. So yeah, even a handheld was not cheap. Amateur News, Piers Healy, VK3YE. He was around for a long time. Remember hearing him on the air. And news on Jota, and this was like 2 or 3 pages of used from various amateur radio clubs around Australia. Some of them are still going. Central Coast Amateur Radio Society, Geelong Radio Electronics, West Lakes are there, and ionospheric propagation. None of these online predictions, you just look here, that's your time, your various bands, your DX paths, and you could see if your bands are open. And book reviews. Now, people would have aspired to have one of these in today's money, like $3,000 or $4,000. And shortwave listening, when there was lots and lots on the shortwave band. Answers to correspondence, yeah, they're worth reading. Lists of components, yep, you would have done your mail order with these lists. And your for sale ad. So, an annual subscription costs you $6.50 per year. And indexed to adverts, lots of adverts. And so, this was Electronics Australia for September 1972, exactly 50 years ago this month.